Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Strange Playgrounds, and welcome to a slightly new venture on the Strange Playgrounds. Welcome to the H.P. Lovecraft retrospectives, in which we're going to be exploring the bizarre and cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, what I've determined to do for this particular series, instead of me just waffling on at you about all and sundry, I've determined to get some guests on to talk about their experience of H.P. Lovecraft and his stories and what influence the man has had on their own imaginations, on their reading, and on their work, in fact. And today, we actually have a very, very special guest on, which some of you may recognise from some of the reviews that I've done on the Ginger Nuts of Horror. Please welcome Lex Jones to the podcast. Lex, hi!
Hi, how you doing?
And welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem at all. Now, some of you may know Lex from his work, actually. You may know him from The Other Side of the Mirror, which is a... How would you describe it, Lex?
It's sort of like a noir crime thriller, I suppose, with slightly surreal elements to it.
It is, isn't it? It's one of the things. Lex was very kind to let me review The Other Side of the Mirror, and one of the things that really drew me to the book was it is a crime thriller, but it's so not.
Yes, yeah.
You know?
I mean, people have said this about a bit of my work, to be honest, but it's difficult to pigeonhole. When people ask me, "Oh, you've wrote a book, what's that about?" It's quite difficult to give you a one-line synopsis for it, to be honest.
I know exactly what you mean. I was trying to describe what it was to some friends of mine. I was actually talking to my mother about it because she loves this kind of thing, and I was sort of like, you've got to read this because you'll love it. And she was like, "Well, what is it?" And I was like, it's like if
the closest
Chandler...
thing people have said is it's either somewhere between Raymond Chandler or Sin City by Frank Miller, or perhaps even like the monologues that Rorschach does in the Watchmen book.
Absolutely. And then you've got this other stuff going on underneath. There's all this sort of... It's not supernatural.
No, but it skirts on the edge of that. It's like, it's slightly surreal. A bit like Twin Peaks, if you like, where it's not full-on supernatural, but it's skirting on the edge of that. It's like you're just about to hop into the road where the supernatural lives, but you never quite step off the curb. It's that kind of a,
What will happen, ladies and gents, as you're reading it, you'll be reading it and you'll be reading the story, and the story is this definite, very gritty, very dark sort of crime drama. Those are almost like detective police procedural stuff. And then you'll notice these little things cropping up, these little twinges in your brain where you're like, that's not the kind of thing that happens in this book. That it's very strange. It suggests supernaturalism without actually ever making it overt.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going for, because I don't worry about pigeonholing my stories, to be honest. I just write what I want to write. But it's had really good response. I didn't know what people were going to think to it, but like your review was lovely. I'm very grateful for that.
I really enjoyed it.
The only bad review... Oh, thank you. The only bad review it's had was... there was one review on Goodreads which wasn't very popular, which was from a priest.
Right, okay. All right.
And his review was basically like, it's not Christian morality, but I was like, well, did you think it would be? What were you thinking?
Like reading the first few chapters, why would you ever think that it would be?
Why would you ever think if that's the basis of his complaint, then fine. But it's
fine, absolutely. And to be fair, it is Goodreads, and
thank you.
The less said, the better about Goodreads. But no, I enjoyed it very, very much indeed. It was my kind of thing. You know what it reminded me of? It reminded me very much of Life on Mars.
Yes, I know what you mean by that. Yeah.
Where you have this suggestion that this may be happening or this may be happening, but it never really comes down on any one side. And it surprised me, and very pleasantly so, that it maintained the ambiguity up to the end.
Yeah, a few people have said about, like what you're saying about the Life on Mars thing, how you watch that and you're like, is this a dream? Is he dead? Is this it? And you're never quite sure. Some people have said to me, which I never even thought when I wrote the book, but a few people have said, is this like purgatory? Are the characters actually, is this in a different reality? And I never even thought of that. I just kind of put it in this weird snow globe where you don't worry about the time period. You don't worry about... Because it's deliberately ambiguous what time period it's set in. It never blatantly said, but also what country, what city, it's never stated, just because I don't think it was necessary. But I never thought, oh, it's actually in purgatory, or it's actually in another dimension. It never really occurred to me to say that, but other people have asked that question.
Well, this is exactly what I was thinking. I was wondering, like, is that what it's getting at, and is it ever gonna? I mean, I would have been less like kind to it. I would have had a slight niggle with it if it did come down on on that explanation, you know what I mean, or on any particular explanation. I love, one of the things I really appreciated about it is the fact that it maintained ambiguity.
Yeah,
because a lot of fiction doesn't. It gets cold feet, you know. It gets cold feet, and it just it feels like it has to give you an explanation. And for me, for that kind of fiction, that is often death.
Yes,
it often kills the mystery, and it becomes very like almost M. Night Shyamalan, you know, where you have to have the big twist and the big explanation at the end, and that would have seriously hampered it. But because it doesn't do that, you can actually go back through the book. It bears rereading, because you can go back and like look for stuff in it, and like, well, what's it? You know, is it getting at that? Getting at this?
I think the other problem with, I mean, there is something of a twist in the book, which I won't go into, but I don't like writing something, or indeed watching, you mentioned M. Night Shyamalan there, but like where the whole point of the film is the twist, or the book, where the story itself is mediocre, but there's a big twist at the end.
Yes.
I didn't want to write one of those, so there is a twist in this, but as you say, it's not about that really, that's just one feature of it.
It doesn't hinge on the twist. That's the thing, isn't it? It's not like the twist comes, but it's not. It's not the be all and end all of the story. No. You know, there's lots of other stuff going on in the same vein as something like, say, Fight Club.
Yes, exactly. You know? It's a brilliant film, and then you've got that twist that they're the same person. But even without that, it's really well
stunning.
done. It's got great characters.
But yes, I mean, go forth, ladies and gents. I will put a link down below, by the way, to the other side of the mirror.
Thank you.
On Hammy Amazon down there in the what I like to call, forgive me, the crotch bar. But yes, today, what have you chosen to talk about today, Lex?
I've chosen The Colour Out of Space, which is one of Lovecraft's short stories, and it's one of his more unusual ones in that I think a lot of people, certainly people who I know who are into horror, have read this story without realising it was a Lovecraft story.
Yeah, and I can kind of see that. Because it is, although it's the kind of story that it is in the upper echelons of Lovecraft's work, definitely. It's kind of one of the iconic ones that it will come up in conversation about Lovecraft. At the same time, it doesn't include a lot of the stuff that people have come to associate with him.
That's what I mean. For sort of people who are, obviously if you're a diehard fan, you know all of them, but for people who are kind of horror fans who have dipped into Lovecraft a bit, if it's not a big cosmic thing and there's tentacles involved, if there's none of that, they don't make the connection to this story. And that's kind of what I think we're getting at when we say the stuff that makes you think of Lovecraft, you know?
Yeah, because there does tend to be this tendency to stereotype Lovecraft, doesn't there?
Yes.
And it is always like this very visual, very elaborate sort of body horror stuff where you get the elaborate creatures and the aliens with starfish-shaped heads and tendrils and multiple eyes, which is there. I mean, that is in Lovecraft, definitely. But there's so much more to the guy's work, I find. He does so much more that has so much more influence and like genetic legacy for fiction.
Yes.
And like The Colour Out of Space, for me, is in many respects the archetypal Lovecraft.
Yes, it is. One of the key elements of it that I love, particularly because I like my old-fashioned sort of fiction, I like a lot of Victorian stuff, and something that I found that Lovecraft stands out from, even with the shorter stories like this one, is that one of the key principles in his work is that bad shit just happens to people whether they deserve it or not. Whereas in a lot of the traditional Victorian ones, like I'm a massive fan of M.R. James, but something in his work is that the people that stuff happens to generally have done something to warrant it. Not necessarily that they're bad people, but they've gone to a crypt and there's a warning, don't dig up this crypt, but they dig up the crypt anyway. Or so there's usually something where you think, well, if you hadn't done that, this wouldn't have happened. But with Lovecraft, you have to have done nothing and this shit's going to happen to you. Yeah. And I think that's quite a key part. The helplessness of it, the powerless. There's no God that's going to save you. You can't say a prayer. The gods hate you and want you dead in Lovecraft's world. There's nothing you can do if they've targeted you.
Well, I think that is one of the biggest factors that makes Lovecraft's fiction so iconic and so interesting, particularly at the time he was writing, which is sort of just after the turn of the century, because a lot, as you said, a lot of Victorian fiction, certainly in the genres that he references and derives influence from, are very moral. They're very heavy-handed in that regard.
That's the word, yeah.
You know, in the sense that the good and the godly survive, and the bad and the wicked, or even just the transgressive, like in M.R. James. I mean, I always think of Whistle and I Come to You, you know?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I've got a tattoo of that booked in next week. That was the first ghost story I ever heard. My grandfather read it to me when I was a child, and he used to tell like an adapted version that was suitable for my age, but I would ask him to tell it over and over and over again, and I was very close with my grandfather. He's no longer with us, sadly, but I credit him as the person who got me into horror. And I've all my tattoos are to do with literary stuff, and next week I'm getting the whistle with the Latin quote on it on my chest.
Brilliance, absolute brilliance. Did you ever see the 1960? I think it's 1963.
Yeah, it's amazing.
So
the
good, isn't it? So
BBC
good.
Ghost Stories for Christmas, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, slight deviation, ladies and gents, but if you haven't seen that adaptation, the BBC adaptation, I think it's from 1963. It may be a bit earlier than that, actually, with Michael Hordern, who played Paddington. It is one of the best pieces of visual ghost fiction you'll ever see.
It's incredible, isn't it? Because all it is a washing sheet on a line that they sort of remove the line, but it's so terrifying when you see
It's like every cliche, isn't it? And it's like, it shouldn't work. You watch it and you're like, it's a ghost in a sheet. It is the ultimate cliche. And yet it's terrifying.
That's where that comes from, though, isn't it? That trope about a ghost looking like someone in a sheet comes from that story.
Does it? Right.
That's the earliest reference I've ever found of a ghost being described that way.
I did not know that.
Well, I might be wrong, but you know, your listeners may well correct this in your comments, but that is the first reference I've ever found to a ghost being described in such a way. And it's only because it manifests itself through his bed sheets, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
But yeah, there is a box set for UK listeners. There's a DVD box set called BBC Ghost Stories for Christmas, and it's in there. Now, it's usually a bit of a pricey one, but the rest of the films in there are fantastic. It's even got collections of
the Signalman and that kind of thing.
Yes, the Signalman. But there's ones with Christopher Lee where it's him impersonating M.R. James, and he's just sat by a fireplace reading the ghost stories, and that's brilliant as well.
What you cannot get better than that. Like at Christmas time, that set with, for me, a bottle of port, near a fire or something. You could not get better than that. Anywho, yes, slight deviation, but go forth, ladies and gents, and find Whistle and I'll Come to You. It's so good. But yeah, The Colour Out of Space is... I so loved rereading it this time round. I so enjoyed it. And I think it's one of the ones that if people do know about Lovecraft, they tend to come to it and they find it slightly weird. But yes, the Colour Out of Space, I find, tends to be one of those stories that, if people are very acutely aware of Lovecraft and they're sort of aware of stories like At the Mountains of Madness or The Call of Cthulhu or Dagon, which do have the big sort of betentacled strange monsters or anything like that, they come to it and they find it slightly odd because it does stand out, doesn't it?
It is. It's got a slightly more degree of subtlety to it. Like a lot of the things, there's more suggestion in it. Like when, like it says, when one of the brothers has gone to live down the well, and it's kind of suggested that he's no longer human, but you never see it.
Yeah,
you never see that. I was expecting at some point, the first time I read this, I thought at some point he's going to come out of that well and he'll have 15 tentacles, and but you never see him again.
It happens to the wife as well, doesn't it? The wife of the Gardner family. All it says is that she slowly degrades, doesn't she? She gets some sort of like incipient madness, and for some reason she's locked up in the attic.
Yes, and he says when they find the body, it doesn't resemble anything human. I think they said.
But it doesn't detail it, does it? It just says like the general outline is strange.
That reminded me, the scene with the wife, the ending of the wife. There is an author called Arthur McCann who you're probably familiar with, who
yes,
Lovecraft
I've heard,
was
definitely
inspired by some of his works. And he did a story called The Novel of the White Powder, which is about this guy who takes, for all intents and purposes, it's basically like heroin or something, but it's meant to like bring out his qualities, but it ends up being something of like a Jekyll and Hyde thing. Again, it's very ambiguous, but it kind of focuses his best qualities and his worst, and it ultimately degrades his body by like separating. It's almost suggested like the goodness is drained out of him, and all that's left is like this putrefied, lack of humanity. And when they find him in the loft at the end where he's fine, it's just described as like this black putrid mass that you can vaguely see a human shape in. And that reminded me with the wife, it reminded me in Colour Out of Space, it brought me back to that story, which I'm sure Lovecraft must have read, given that he was inspired by Arthur McCann.
Well, he was a very prolific reader, wasn't he?
Yes.
I mean, he was quite an isolated guy by all accounts. I mean, one of the things that does strike me about Colour Out of Space, this time round, when he's describing, like, the scientists from Arkham, from the university, who come to chip off a bit of the meteor and to explore it, he talks about all sorts of stuff. He references alchemy, and he references, like, science and chemistry and occultism and all sorts of stuff. And very often, he isn't just sort of, like, playing flim-flam there, as writers tend to do. He isn't just making it up on the fly. He's actually talking about like chemical processes and knowledge, and he seems to be very, very aware of this stuff.
Yeah, that layers it, I think. It really gives it a level of depth, which I do understand that, because I tried to do that with my own. Like I wrote a story recently which is slightly Lovecraftian, and it's called The Shape Off the Bow. It's a seafaring story set like in the 17th century. Now, the fact that it's on a fishing vessel in the 17th century is just the framing device, but nevertheless I spent so long researching 17th century fishing techniques just to get the accuracy of what do you call that bit, what do you call the sail, what do they call it when they do this, just because if you don't get that stuff right, it doesn't feel layered properly, it doesn't feel real. And if you're asking people to believe in meteors that have got weird gases in them and mutations and all that, you've got to get the other stuff right. And otherwise, what it always reminds me of is, do you remember this is one for the British listeners, but do you remember the sketch show that Mitchell and Webb did?
Yeah.
And they did a hospital drama on it. And it was basically a hospital drama where it's a comedy thing, but they couldn't be bothered to research the medical stuff. So it's just doctors running around the hospital going, get one of those thingies that you put in his arm to make his head stop hurting. And it's just all of that. And it's worth watching on YouTube if you find it. It's hilarious. But that is what I think of. When you read something and they clearly haven't researched, what do you call this method of science? How do you do this? Even if it's just one scene, like you said with Lovecraft, I think it's worth doing just to add that level of reality to it.
Well, I mean, Lovecraft was very much a stickler for that. I mean, have you read any of his journals at all, or any of his like correspondence with people?
I haven't actually, no.
He was such a stickler for that kind of thing. He would get very upset whenever he did something inaccurate. He would get very upset with himself and very really self-excoriating, absolutely annoyed that he hadn't researched it properly, and with other people too. Actually, he would get very angry. And if you ever feel down about your own work, if you ever feel like demotivated or whatever, go and read Lovecraft's journals on his own writing. He was absolutely self-excoriating. But he was also very learned. I mean, but he was an isolated guy, by all accounts, very academic, absolutely loved to read from the earliest possible age. So he was acutely aware of a lot of this stuff, the scientific disciplines of the era, alchemy, occultism. He was definitely very aware of things like, for example, evolutionary sciences and cosmology.
Yes. All
Clearly
of that has kind
very
of a relevance,
aware.
doesn't it, in the stories that he writes? You can kind of see the touches of that, like the origins of man as a question mark, as opposed to, again, most supernatural fiction around that time where there's God and there's the devil and that's it. There's no question for anything else. But the idea that this new mythology, that actually maybe that's not the case, maybe our origins are more mysterious than that is obviously densely layered within Lovecraft's fiction.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it refers back to what you were talking about earlier, where he derives influence from the Victorian writers, and then he kind of inverts them.
Yes.
He kind of tries to transgress and transcend them. So, I mean, this is, in style, The Colour Out of Space is a really Victorian story.
Yes, it is.
You know, it's retrospective,
That's
so
what I
it's
was
told
going to
through
say,
like
the fact
a.
that it's someone else saying, here's a funny thing that happened.
Yeah,
That's very Victorian, isn't it?
It's very Victorian, and like, I mean, you would struggle to find a popular work of fiction from Victoriana that wasn't like that.
Yeah.
Because it was just the style at the time. You did not get like the notion of having immediate fiction where there is stuff happening to the protagonist or to the narrator didn't really occur until much later on. Much later on.
That's why Victorian horror makes such good stories to sort of tell around a fireplace, isn't it? Because if you're the storyteller, you can't be saying, this happened to me and then I died.
Of course.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's got to be, here's something that happened to a chap that I knew once, and it goes from there. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's someone who is, I mean, the story is actually told from the perspective of, he's a surveyor, isn't he, or something to that effect.
Yes.
He's come to sort of visit the outlands of Arkham.
Yeah, because they're going to be building a dam and it's going to flood
That's
this
it.
area, and he's got to make sure there's nothing that's going to be damaged by that, and that's of course, it's right where the blasted heath is, and,
Of course.
he speaks with the residents who's like, don't go there, so of course he does, and
Yeah.
and
Your
then he
classic
gets the
sort of
story.
Lovecraft character
Yes.
who know what happened, who saw everything happen, and he gets the sort of story from him, doesn't he? He's
That's
sort of-
correct, yeah.
He was the neighbour of the Gardner family.
That's right.
Whose farm the meteorite fell on.
Speaking of the meteor, when you mentioned that the scientists chip away at it, there was something in my reread of it before we did this podcast that I'd forgotten about, which is how I think this story was an early influencer for the film The Blob, because when they first describe the meteor, he says there's like a jelly thing in it, which they poke it and it pops like a bubble, and that's when the gas comes out. But just the idea of a meteor and there's this jelly blob thing in it, and that's the alien, that's got to have had an influence on the Blob.
The Blob is definitely. I mean, it's something I was thinking about just before we came on. Actually, I was thinking about like the genetic legacy of this story.
Yes.
And I think even people who know Lovecraft, who enjoy Lovecraft, tend to underestimate just how profound the genetic legacy of his work is in fiction, certainly in genre fiction. I mean, you can't get away from it.
I think
you actually cannot get away from it.
I was aware of Lovecraftian horror way before I'd read any Lovecraft. Just totally, you see it through things like the Ghostbusters film. Gozer is basically a Lovecraftian entity.
The structure of Ghostbusters is a Lovecraftian story, isn't it?
Of course it is. There's this weird, when you get this constellation right, this old god can come return to Earth, but he can't take his true form on the planet, and all of that stuff is very Lovecraftian.
Yeah.
But so many cartoons and video games and all sorts have got that sort of a ancient beings from other realms, and it's not as simple as heaven and hell, and there's all that kind of stuff. It was there, so I was really into that kind of thing, even like big tentacly monsters from under the sea, way before I'd read any Lovecraft books. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people now. They might not think they're into Lovecraft, and yet half of the things they've experienced and enjoyed within horror probably are influenced by it.
Oh yeah, I totally agree, and my experience of Lovecraft is exactly the same. Like, I was so aware of what was Lovecraftian before I ever came to Lovecraft specifically, through things like video games and also through fiction. I mean, like stuff like Stephen King is obviously, his work is massively influenced by Lovecraft. You've got, I mean, if you look at stories like, say, for example, the Tommyknockers.
Yes, very much.
The Tommyknockers is basically. It's like The Colour Out of Space, isn't it? It is this very similar setup, very similar, even a very similar explanation. I'd say it's not as successful as The Colour Out of Space. I mean, one of the things that I really took away from my rereading for this podcast was just how wonderfully Lovecraft plays this really clever sleight of hand where, like, when it comes to describing what's inside the meteor, for example, he kind of describes it, but then doesn't.
Yeah, he stays away from... You never quite get a full explanation. Which, to me, it gives you the impression of, like, when you don't quite want to see something, so you look at it through your fingers. It's like that, which I think is a good effect to have in horror. Because if this neighbour can say, oh yeah, they were this absolutely terrifying monster, I'll tell you exactly what it looked like because I stood staring at it for 10 minutes, then it can't be that scary, can it?
Absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, it is a brilliant form of horror. I love it when any horror medium does that. You know, when it suggests stuff.
Yeah. Yes.
And you're not quite sure of what you've seen or whether you've actually seen anything. I love that, and that is actually really hard to do in a non-visual medium.
Yes.
Because of course you have to describe something.
Yeah, on a film it's much easier because you can have the camera cut away or something like that.
Exactly.
And just see
or
the
something in the
character screaming
background
or something. But it's very difficult in a book to vaguely give an impression of something without.
But I tell you what, he
saying.
does it beautifully in this story. He does it beautifully because you never quite know what this thing is.
Do you know?
It doesn't.
That's just reminded me. Have you read? There's a series of graphic novels of Lovecraft stories now. Where they've basically done like comic book versions of the short stories.
Right.
There's one of Mountains of Madness, but then there's the two collections of short stories, and Colour Out of Space is in one of them. And do you know what? Honestly, it doesn't work.
No,
because they draw everything. So when you see when you see the boy in the bottom of the well, you see him and he's all deformed and that. You see the mum in the attic. You see the colour when it comes up out of the well, and you see it, and it's
do
like
you actually see the colour?
Yeah, it's like a rainbow cloud type jellyfish thing. But it doesn't work. It really doesn't work when you see it.
Because that's the point of the story, isn't it? I mean, what Lovecraft is trying to do with this, he was so clearly dissatisfied with horror stories about like alien influences and alien invasions and whatnot. It's so clear from this story, because what he's trying to do is redefine what that is. He's trying to make the alien truly alien, like extra-dimensional, something that totally defeats our preconceptions of what that means.
It does.
So he never comes down on any one thing. So is it a creature, or is it like a pollution? Is it a disease?
There's certainly not any will to it. There's no will to the being in this that we could understand. I tell you what reminded me of it very recently on television. What reminded me, I watched it just after I reread the book, is the Chernobyl TV series.
Right, yes.
Just that idea of we've cracked something open that we don't really understand, and now it's doing horrendous things that we have very little ability to stop. That's the sort of feel it has, which is ironic that this was written before radiation was even something people knew about.
Because clearly, I mean, if you read it now and you didn't know when it was written, you would automatically think that it was a metaphor for fallout, for radioactive fallout, wouldn't you?
You really would think that. Yeah, I could. If someone had said this was written in 1989 and it was based on Chernobyl, I'd think, I can see that. But it wasn't at all. It was like 80 years before that.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? There is a sort of science fiction prescience to it
in
that regard.
Yeah, and this power we don't understand that has a corruptive influence, not just the people but the environment. It describes
the environment,
the trees are one of the scariest things, I think. The branches of the trees are moving but there's no wind. That's one of the creepiest images I've ever read in a story, to be honest.
And I love the way he escalates it.
Yes.
Yeah, like at the end, you know, when they're the team who go in to actually see what's happened on the Gardner farm, they're overlooking the absolute collapse of the whole area, and the trees he describes them as almost like the colour explodes from the edges of their branches, and it's like they've got eyes. It's like they're sort of swaying, and they're almost alive. It's almost like they've become like the follicles or the tendrils of whatever this influence is.
Yes. But it is really like radiation, isn't it? Like if what had crashed down into that well, next to the well rather, was a massive lump of plutonium, the effect would be very similar, killing the grass, mutations on the people, the well being poisoned, the cows dying. It would be the same effect.
It is. I mean, it's so overt, isn't it? It's almost impossible to preconceive that he actually he would have had no knowledge. I mean, he would have known a little bit about radiation, but nothing like the fallout of a nuclear bomb or anything like that.
It never happened
of course.
At that point, so they had no knowledge of that from which to base these kind of ideas on.
Mm-hmm. But yes, I mean, what you were talking about before, when there is a comic, there is like a graphic version of this story, I have a lot of time for anyone who would ever attempt to visualize this story, because you can't. It's so difficult.
Yeah,
it's so difficult to do, because for one thing, you can't portray the color itself.
No, that's where it falls short, because the whole point is it's a colour you can't imagine, which you can't
exactly
imagine. Trying to imagine it hurts your head, and that's the point.
Yeah,
that's kind of
that's
point.
The whole point. So if you try to record it in a visual medium, just the only way I could think of you could do it is just by showing the reactions of people to it.
Yeah, that's about as close as you could get, isn't it? but it's as soon as you do it on screen, of course it's going to be a colour that we recognise, because what else could we do?
Well, what else could you do unless you somehow found a way of inventing or revealing a new colour to the human eye? What could you do? Yeah, because that's the point, isn't it? This is what Lovecraft is going for. He's trying to describe the indescribable, to bring something to the reader that is so alien you can't even imagine it. It's actually outside of human experience.
That's one of the traits in his mythology that I like the most, is the idea that if you see some of these things, you'd go insane because your brain physically cannot cope with it.
And it's actually it's one of the more subtle efforts at that. I mean, what he tends to do in a lot of his work, and it sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't, is he goes overboard with the explanation of it.
Yes.
So he'll At the Mountains of Madness is probably the best example of that, which is actually my favourite of his stories. But the descriptions of like the elder things, but it's so minutely anatomically detailed and yet so alien, you actually can't get a grasp on what it looks like.
I like that in a way, because I'm not quite sure how he pulls it off. He describes it in minute detail, but you still can't picture what he's on about. Which makes me wonder, did he picture it, or was he just throwing things in that description?
I wonder, I do wonder, did he sit down and actually like very specifically detail what the anatomies of these creatures is like, or did he like just try to layer in as much as feasibly possible and as strange as possible to throw the reader off?
Yeah, it does make you wonder whether that was deliberate, to try and give you this sort of vague... Mm-hmm. You can picture some elements of it, but you couldn't draw a picture of it properly. That's the sort of thing. It's
why, like, if you go online and you like looked at, I mean, people have tried to do pictures of the elder things and of Shoggoths and of stuff like that. But if you look through, you will find so many different interpretations of what those creatures look like. Well, because it's impossible. It's actually impossible to pin down.
Well, I've got I've started a series of children's books based on Lovecraft's work, sort of like reimagining it. I'm searching for a publisher for the first one at the moment, but the first one is based on Call of Cthulhu to some degree, with some elements of Dagon in it as well. But the second one is sort of from the Mountains of Madness, and the illustrator for that is going to have an attempt at drawing like a childlike version of a Shoggoth,
of the elder thing,
the elder things as well.
So God!
Yeah.
Very best of luck.
But that's not up to. I don't have to draw it, so it's fine.
Yeah, that's a tall order. That is. Very best of luck to it.
Yeah.
But with the colour out of space, he does the exact opposite.
Yes. So
it's impossible to actually describe, isn't it? It's a colour that you can't see, but it's not just a colour. It's an influence. It's like it's a gas. It's an emission. It's a liquid. It's a fluid. It's so many different things. And of course, towards the end of the story, when you get that wonderful like apocalyptic vision of the heath, like just breaking apart and collapsing in on itself, something comes up. Something rises out of the soil and out of the ground, but it's not a creature. It's something else. It's something less specific than that. Something that ascends to the stars, and you can't tell what it is.
No, I think that's better. Again, just leaving it that way. But I just thought the whole point of it was like it's very much a really like a proper alien story, in that it's just something that lands here seemingly accidentally, has no place being here, doesn't fit with any of our understanding of life or solids, liquid gases, or all of that.
It defeats every preconception, doesn't it?
And then it just goes as soon as it's able to do so.
Yeah,
but and that's it. That's all that happens. But everything around it is the effect it has.
Oh, it's hideous, isn't it? And it's slow. That's the worst thing about it. Like Fallout, like radiation, it's really slow and insidious. So you get like.
I was asked on an interview with a friend recently. He said, "What do you think would be the worst animal to be attacked by?" And I said something parasitic. I would much rather have my arm ripped off by a lion or a shark than have something that lays eggs in me that are going to hatch out of my skin a month later. Do you know? I'd rather just have the lion just rip me in half, because it's immediate, it's done, it's not got that invasive fear producing. You know it's in there and it's going to do something. You know, that's anything body horror like that is terrifying.
Yeah.
And
where it sort of turns your own body against you, or
Colour
it
Out of
corrupts.
Space is full of that stuff, isn't it?
Oh, it's total body horror, isn't it? I mean, it gets like Cronenbergian at times.
It does, yeah.
This story, you get this sense of like this very slow, insidious. I wouldn't even say it's rot. It's more like a corruption. It's a mutating factor.
Yes.
In the land, in the water, in the air, the animal. You know, when he's describing what the Gardner family hear outside their farm of a night, when the life and the local like vermin have all been transformed and mutated by this thing. It's so brilliant. I mean, it's terrifying. It's absolutely chilling on multiple different levels. So you've got the corruption of the land and of the crops and of the food and of the water, and that's horrifying in and of itself, because this family are slowly they're not only starving, they're not only dying of thirst, they're going slowly mad as this stuff is corrupting them.
Yeah.
But you've also got the external threats. So you've got these animals that have been tainted by this stuff and have been transformed by it, like not just physically but psychologically.
I think an interesting part of that, though, is the fact that the family does go insane is kind of a blessing, because imagine being in full control of your faculties and going through that.
Yeah.
Do you know? And I always think
awful,
that's something of a saving grace in a lot of body horror things. So, like when you watch something like that film Society, or even like the Resident Evil films, you always get that point where someone's horribly mutated and they suddenly go, this is pretty cool, look how powerful I am now, and then it doesn't matter anymore. But I think, imagine how much scarier it would be if you never reached that point. Imagine if you didn't want it to happen, if your mind didn't shatter and you stayed perfectly lucid throughout, that'd be even worse.
It's hideous. I mean, it is horrible, isn't it? And it's one of those things Lovecraft doesn't do very often, actually. He doesn't do, like, characters as such very often.
No.
You get, like,
vehicles to
narrators.
tell the story, aren't they?
Pretty much. Yeah, they're just narrators, aren't they, by and large? You know, they serve a particular function for the story. But here you actually do get quite a few distinct characters, like Naum Gardner and his family are really distinct in this story.
They are,
and so you actually do... You do sympathise with them, you know, you actually do get this sense of personal connection that you very rarely get in a Lovecraft story. And you get a sense of that intimate horror, like the collapse of their family. Naum himself, he's the last one to go, obviously, so he gets to see his wife go mad and lose, you know, not just go mad, but become something truly hideous, where he has to lock her up in the attic. One of his children go the same way, and the other one just disappears.
Yeah, the attic thing, I'll come back to that, but that was... The way that was described, I thought, was quite chilling. In that it wasn't like... it was just the matter-of-factness of it. Just that, the wife became something so terrible that he locked her in the attic and then just carried on. And you're like, hang on, let's go back to that a minute. What was this?
Hang on. Hang on 1 minute, you know, what the hell are you talking about, man? He's had to lock his wife and child up in the attic. I mean, come on.
But the fact that that is just one incident in a line of things makes it even worse, because it doesn't give you time to focus on it.
No, it just gets worse, doesn't it? It is the story of the Gardner family is probably one of the most like personably horrific in all of Lovecraft, because it's just the utter destruction of their lives. And as you said, it's not because they've done anything.
No.
They didn't go seeking anything out. They haven't, like a lot of characters in Lovecraft, they perform some occult ritual, or they go seeking for something that they shouldn't be seeking for, or something, you know, they open the Necronomicon or something like that. These people are just farmers.
They're just farmers. Something crashes on the land and then everything goes to hell for them. They haven't done... They're not even bad people. There's nothing to suggest that they might, even on a cosmic scale, there's nothing to suggest they deserve this.
They've done nothing wrong. They've done nothing wrong at all. It's just this thing just arbitrarily turns up, and it's antithetical to reality.
Have you?
It's like...
Sorry, have you played the most recent
go ahead.
Resident Evil game, Resident Evil 7?
Resi 7?
Yes.
Yeah, I loved it.
That had elements of this, because you turn up and this family's all mutated and horrible. But then when you find the diaries and the photographs, it suggested that before that umbrella ship crashed nearby with whatever it was carrying, they were quite a nice, normal family, weren't they?
Yeah.
So
it's
they're
actually
very
really
similar
clever,
to that, isn't it?
Actually, the influence, I never connected the dots, but actually, now that I think about it, the influence of the Color Out of Space on Resi 7 in particular is huge.
It is quite strong, isn't it? Obviously, it's a man-made thing. It's a ship that crashes with a bioweapon on it that leaks into, this family finds it. It even says in the diary, the father goes into the ship to try and rescue anybody that he can rescue. These are nice people. These are good people.
They're nice people.
And then they get infected by this thing, which turns them into what it does. But it's the element. But that is very much like the Colour Out of Space. That there's nothing to suggest these people were awful people at all.
No.
And then they become victims of something.
Is that you assume that they are, when you first meet them, in the sort of Texas Chainsaw Massacre
exactly.
scene at the
It
beginning.
makes you think that they are that kind of inbred hick family, but they're really not. You piece that together.
In fact, wasn't the dad a scientist?
He was, yeah.
Yeah. So basically,
nice
it plays on your prejudices, doesn't it?
Mm.
It's very clever. It leads you to believe that these people were actually just like the people from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. They're just inbred. They're cannibals. They're lunatics. They're not.
No,
they're not.
They're the victims of something that's beyond their ability, and it corrupts them body and soul and mind into something else. That's where I drew the parallel to Colour Out of Space. I think there is a similarity there.
I think totally. I mean, the setup is so similar. It's so similar. And even the dynamic of the story is very, 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 very similar indeed. But yeah, and again, it goes back to what we were talking about, the genetic legacy of these stories.
Yes.
It's not just the Colour Out of Space, but Lovecraft in general. People who have never read a Lovecraft story have read Lovecraft.
Yes, exactly. That's it. Yeah, they've played a game where it's inspired by it. They've watched a film. There's all sorts of stuff in there where I know people who've said that. Oh, I've heard about Lovecraft, but I'm really not bothered about it. And then their favourite film's the Evil Dead franchise.
Yeah, and it's like, well, hang on. It's got the Necronomicon in it. It's like, absolutely, or The Thing, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's totally Lovecraftian story. It's totally Lovecraftian.
Yeah, very much.
But it's so interesting to me. It's so interesting to me that this story in particular, I think, for my money, I'm so glad you chose it, because it's one of the strongest, I think, of Lovecraft stories by a country mile.
I'll tell you why I think that as well, is because you don't need to have read the others. Because something that I think bleeds into some of the others a little bit is that everything comes back to the same mythology. So that the villain in it is a Cthulhu worshipper or a Nyarlathotep worshipper, or the monster is one of Cthulhu's spawn or family or old ones. One of the things I like about Colour Out of Space is how, in a way, it kind of stands apart from the other mythologies. Obviously, part of the same Lovecraft mythology, but it's not directly linked to it. Like, a lot of his stories remind me of when I was a child and I'd watch things like He-Man, and everything always had to link back to the main bad guy, which was Skeletor. So it'd be a monster Skeletor had made, or a robot, or an army of monsters that worshipped Skeletor, or whatever. We'd always come back to him. Where it was like it was impossible to have any kind of a threat that wasn't linked back to Skeletor, whereas and Lovecraft stories are often the same. Everything's either one of the old ones, or a spawn of the old ones, or a cult that worships the old ones, or something. Whereas the Colour Out of Space kind of doesn't. There's a couple of vague references to the stars and the constellations seeming intimidating in a way they're not usually, which is stuff that's referenced in the other Lovecraft stories. But apart from that, it very much stands on its own, and you don't connect it directly with all the other stuff.
No, and I think that's very deliberate, to be honest. It's almost like it's alien even to the established mythology of Lovecraft stories. He really wanted this, it seems to me, to be like the ultimate alien story, in the sense that it's not just about aliens from other worlds, it's about an alien influence, something you can't even fathom. And that's where the horror derives from,
Yes, it is, but that's another way. Now you've just said that. That's an interesting way, another way in which it's similar to Resident Evil 7, because all the other Resident Evil games are part of this massive mythology to do with the Umbrella Corporation and all of that.
The T-Virus
is a side, exactly, and the Raccoon City Police Department and all that. This is a little side story where here's a little ship that crashers carrying some of their toxic shit, and a little family who knows nothing about all of that mythology get infected by it, and your protagonist is someone who is not one of the Raccoon Stars guys. He's none of that. It's completely adjunct to all of that, but it's sort of linked in nonetheless, and that's another way in which it's similar to it, I think.
It's very clever, actually, because when you first start playing the game, I mean, really, right up until the closing chapters, you wouldn't even know that it is linked to the previous mythology of the...
It's not forced to be. No. All they'd have to do to make it an independent game is take out the very end scene where...
Yes, where Leon turns up. Yeah.
And when you find the ship, just take off the Umbrella logos on everything. Yep. And then it could just be any old horror game with toxic waste on a ship or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is sort of how the Colour Out of Space works too, isn't it? It is not the kind of thing that one would expect to find in a collection of Lovecraft tales, despite the fact that it is like one of the most iconic and most brilliant. It stands apart. It's its own very strange, self-contained thing. Other than the fact that, of course, it occurs in Arkham, which is Lovecraft's city where everything goes wrong. I mean, you wouldn't want to live there, would you? Let's put it that way.
No, the property prices must be pretty good.
You'd expect so. Yeah, probably quite a nice one as well. I mean, the way he describes Arkham as being like this sort of rambling Byzantine Gothic, almost like old Massachusetts used to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the kind of impression I always get from it. Like
the spires.
I mean, America, obviously we're British, so America doesn't have old places the way England has old places. No. But it's like about as old as American places get, isn't it? It's that kind of a feel.
It's an archaic town, isn't it? There's something slightly mysterious about it all. And every other day, there's some weird occult thing going down there.
I always wonder about the timeline. I don't know if there even is one, to be honest.
I'm sure someone's tried. To put together a timeline, but I'm not sure Lovecraft himself ever did.
No, because I just wondered, like you say, at some point people in that city are going to start thinking it's a bit weird here, isn't it?
It is.
you think, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Or maybe what happens is because they're so used to it, it's just like, oh, well, it's another Lovecraftian entity rampaging down the street there. Neighbours started sprouting tentacles again. Oh, another one, eh?
Because it's not that isolationist, is it? I mean,
no,
that's the other thing about, like, say, M.R. James's story. There's a lot of stuff like, let's use Whistle, and I'll come to you as an example. Yeah. Nobody else sees jack shit except the guy who finds the whistle.
Of course, yeah.
So it's completely isolationist, whereas a lot of Lovecraft stuff, like the crew on the boat that sees Cthulhu for the first time.
The sea Cthulhu,
Zealand. There's quite a few sailors on that who survive to tell the story. And
who actually see, like, Cthulhu itself. Yeah, totally. Here, I mean, like, the surveyor and his team, when they come to talk to Naum and whatnot, they see everything.
Yeah, it's
There's
a whole
loads
group
of people here.
It's not one person you can pass off as a madman. Even with like Innsmouth, that's a whole town that's affected by like the taint and Dagon and all that. And it's not small scale stuff.
No, this is big. I mean, that again is a marker of Lovecraft, isn't it? He goes for, like, he's not that interested in the personal horror, although you do get it in this particular story. He's about the big horror, the cosmic horror.
That makes it scarier, though, because in a way, by making it smaller scale, it makes us feel... Sorry, by making it larger scale, it makes us feel smaller, which is kind of his point. Because
it's his whole thing, isn't it?
This stuff isn't hiding away like ghosts do in dark rooms in mansions that you might never visit. This is happening right here in the middle of your cities, and everyone's going to see it, and there's nothing you can do about it.
There's nothing you can do. And also, it's not interested in you. That's the other thing, isn't it? This isn't like... It doesn't come to the Gardner family because they're what it wants. They're incidental. They're completely incidental. They just happen to be victims on the side,
I was hoping they were going to go for that with the new Godzilla films, to be honest.
Yeah.
The kind of these ancient beings that are kind of indifferent to the fact that humanity's underneath them, literally. But then they have all these scenes of, like, humans petting them on the nose and stuff, and it's like, oh, you've lost that now.
Yeah.
It just, things like that work best for me when they're barely even aware that we exist. In fact, there's a game, again, another Lovecraftian influence. It's in a game. There's a game series called Crisis. Have you played that one?
Yeah, I know Crisis.
There's a quote on that where they're talking about the aliens, and one of the it might be on 2 or 3, I can't remember. It was a few years back. One of the guys says about the aliens, they basically seeded this world centuries ago, millennia ago, to come back and live on at some point.
Right.
And they've come back now, and they're not happy about what they find growing behind the fridge.
Yes, so that's basically what we are.
That's how they describe humanity. It's like, we've built this somewhere else, we've planted some plants, we're going to go away for a bit, for an amount of time which to them is nothing, and then they come back, and it's like, what the fuck is all this?
There's an infestation. We're going to have to break out the antifungal aids here.
Exactly, and that is how like Lovecraftian entities would see us as well.
Totally,
it's just an inconvenience.
It's a temporary
what is this thing here? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. That is absolutely it. That is, for me, that's the epitome of Lovecraft. That's what he's trying to do, isn't it? He's trying to dehumanize horror. So he's trying to take away the notion that sort of humanity is the core of the universe and the be-all and end-all. What he's actually saying is, humanity is nothing. It's a blip. It's a speck. In terms of, like, cosmological history, it's nothing.
Which is also goes against the sort of the Christian mythology that you get in traditional Victorian stuff, where we are the pinnacle, we're special. Whatever happens, it's all right because God loves you and He'll save you if you pray nicely and that. There's none of that because God doesn't exist. It's a completely different rules in this universe of Lovecraft.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, even when there are like entities that we would call sort of divine or infernal, things like Cthulhu, for example, they're not. They're actually aliens. They're actually these extra-dimensional beings.
Yeah. It's kind of like there's nothing particularly supernatural about them. It's sort of like the way we view them, it's just because their capabilities and their scale is so far beyond us. It's the same way that a slug would view a human being.
Exactly.
You know, the things that we do. Yeah, we walk around, we wear clothes, we talk, we build machines, we drive cars, we can go into space. How could a slug comprehend any of that? It's they would look at us as gods if they had that level of consciousness. And it's just the same thing. That they're not actually mystical beings.
No.
It's just things that are so far beyond us that it looks that way to our understanding. And I think that was somewhat, I don't know if the word blasphemous is the right word, but I think that would be how it was viewed, I think, a lot, by suggesting that humans are nowhere near the top of the scale of creation.
Well, it's antithetical to almost every religion you can think of, isn't it? It's totally antithetical. They're all, because they're produced by humans, they're very human-based, you know?
Yeah.
Whereas Lovecraft dares to say, well, no, actually, the universe, and even if there is a sort of metaphysics in the universe, it doesn't care.
Yeah.
At best, it's indifferent. At worst, it regards you as an irritant, something to be exterminated.
Definitely. I think indifference is very strong within the colour out of space. I really don't sense any, there's no malice in it.
No.
There's no, it's just something that happens. Something crash lands here, whether it's sentient or not, and bad things happen as a result, and then it leaves. Yeah. But the devastation it caused probably never even crosses its mind. It's totally unaware of that.
It's as a result of the... Sorry, go on.
It's like if you trip over tomorrow and fall on an anthill, you get up, dust yourself off and walk off and carry on your way to work. It's basically that. It's basically that's the equivalent of it. You're not thinking about what devastation you've just caused and the ants and how that's affected their society.
Of course. I mean, on an even wider scale, like, you know, we, by measure of our existence, every breath is a genocide. You know, we massacre like millions of microorganisms and whatnot with every breath, with every heartbeat, you know? Do we think about them in any particular way? No, of course we don't. I think that's how Lovecraft's entities operate. They're so far beyond any sort of existential level that we operate on that it's like they would only be aware of us in the same way that we are aware of microorganisms in like a drop of water.
Yes. And I think this is one of the reasons that I'm hoping some things would work, but by and large, I hope they don't do a proper Lovecraft film, because I don't think you could convey that in a film. I think Cthulhu in particular would just end up being a Godzilla thing.
Yes, it would be very difficult. It would be very, very, very hard to do. I mean, it's a challenge, and it's the kind of thing where I would love to see certain directors try to do it and try to capture like that essential ethos of Lovecraft without making it too visual, without making it too overt. It's a challenge in that regard, but it's so difficult to do and do well, it's almost impossible.
You could do a good. I think there was one of Colour Out of Space, but I don't know how faithful it was. I've not seen
I
it.
think there have been a couple of Colour Out of Space. There have been a couple of films derived from it over the years. They're not called The Colour Out of Space. They're called some, they've got other titles. And none of them are massively successful. But I'm sure I remember reading somewhere there is a film in production of it right now.
That could work. That's what I was going to say. This is one of the ones that could work because you don't need the big monster thing. This could work as a film if they keep it quite tight to what it's supposed to be about.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a lot of other Lovecraft ones just blatantly would not work, as we've discussed. But I think this could work. I think they could do this by focusing on... I mean, it actually gives you more what you need for a film than most Lovecraft stories do with regards to the personal effect it has on the people, which, as you said earlier, you don't usually get that much in Lovecraft's characters.
No, so you do actually have a story there. There is something you could focus on in like a film or a TV series. I mean, for my money, if they brought the story indoors, for example, so you saw everything from the effect that was happening to the Gardner family, rather than showing you what was going on outside and whatnot, that could work really well. Make it like a psychological story.
Yeah, I agree. I think that would work. You could even do it as I'm not particularly a fan of them, but it'd even work as like a found footage one, to be honest. With them documenting what's happening on their own farm. I mean, that'd have to bring it forward to the modern day, but it'd still work.
I could see that. I could definitely see that. I think that'd be really clever, actually. It takes some work to make it fly. But I think that could be brilliant,
I think that'd be the best approach, because it'd keep everything sort of off camera, literally, and figuratively speaking, because you don't want to see the thing down the well. You don't want to see the colour. You just, I mean, the camera could go blurry every time they go anywhere near looking at the colour. So
maybe that's very clever actually, because it could have an effect on the camera itself, on like technology.
That'd be a nice cop-out of avoiding having to show it, wouldn't it?
That's actually quite brilliant. I mean, that is... it's subtle, it's clever, it's very immediate, it's something you could just do. That could work. That, for me, is probably one of the best ways of trying to realise this story.
I think so. I think it would work that way. I've no idea. I didn't even know there was a film in production, so I've no idea what they're going for. But
apparently,
if it comes out and it's found footage, I am going to claim producer credits on that.
Brilliance. Well, I think we may have exhausted that one, Lex. I think we've chewed that one right down to the marrow. Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't read The Colour Out of Space, you will find it in almost every Lovecraft anthology or collection out there. And in quite a few that are not Lovecraft-based, that are just collections of like cosmic horror or whatever. You'll find it. It's so well distributed. Go and read it. Even if you're not really a fan of Lovecraft, I think you might find something to enjoy in this one.
I agree with that, definitely.
Lex, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me. This has been an absolute pleasure. No, it's been a pleasure. It really has. And thank you for choosing this subject. Beyond the other side of the mirror, is there anything that you want to pimp out before we go?
I've got my first collection of short horror stories coming out, possibly later this year. It will be, if you follow me on Twitter, it's at Lex H Jones, and I put all my releases and stuff on there. And if you like sort of Lovecraftian horror or M.R. James sort of horror, that kind of subtle, more old-fashioned sort of horror, that's the kind of stuff I write. I've got a lot of stories like that out there at the moment, but this will be my first sort of collected edition of them. So if you wanted to read like a bulk of some of my work without having to buy like 15 different books, then this might be one to pick up. The working title is called Whistling Past the Graveyard, and it will be on my Twitter when it's out, so please do give me a follow if you're interested.
Links below, by the way, ladies and gents. Once again, links below.
Thank you.
As for me, you can find me hanging around here on the Exaggerated Elegy channel. You can find collections of short fiction over at strangeplaygrounds.com and on Amazon, including Born in Blood Volume 1, which I'm very, very pleased with. Apart from that, you can also find me on Twitter at Enigmatic Elegy. Until next time, ladies and gents, goodbye.
Goodbye.